Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Can Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Amy Hughes. We are talking about a book called Christian Women in the Patristic World that she wrote with Lynn Cohick. Some people might be familiar with her. But either way, it is a really interesting discussion about women that were leaders or philosophers or had interesting positions in a time period when that was not very common. So we're going to be talking about that today and the different interesting stories there. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Hughes?
I'm doing awesome.
Awesome. All right. So, you guys can check out the description for the book. Highly recommend it. Also, I would, you can check out the description for her bio and all that kind of stuff. But we're going to just go ahead and get into it. So, one of the ones we talked about was, I guess, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Macrina.
Mhm.
That person. Could you just give us an overview of who that was?
Sure. So, Macrina lived in the late 4th century. So, she is the sister of Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea.
Hmm.
Who are those people? Between Gregory of Nyssa, Basil of Caesarea, and their college buddy, Gregory of Nazianzus, they're collectively known as the Cappadocians. And some people might go, oh, I've heard that before, those people. If you don't know who those people are, they're the ones that basically did the Trinity in the 4th century. So
Huh.
if you've ever said the Nicene Creed, that's because of them.
Oh.
So they're the ones that even facilitated that council that worked through that. They're
Hmm.
the ones that worked through the theology of the Spirit. The first book on the Holy Spirit was written by Basil of Caesarea. So Macrina is the sister that's right in between Gregory and Basil, and she is the one who uh, basically Gregory credits with kind of holding the family together,
Hmm.
both relationally, theologically, and
Hmm.
also how one lived her life. She turned their house into like a pre. This was before monasteries were a big thing. She kind of turned their house into kind of what functioned as a household monastery. She emancipated all the slaves in their house, and she's like, "I'm going to bake bread too," and all these people are free, which is also kind of wild. And Gregory writes 2 different pieces about her, talking about her life and having conversations with her about very deep theological questions.
Hmm. Really interesting. Okay, and her brothers, they were bishops, right? So they had
Yes.
formal positions in the church.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So something you talked about was how I guess their father died,
Mhm.
and so I don't know which one. I guess it was Gregory of Nyssa talks about how she was the spiritual mentor and of the household.
Yeah.
So could you talk about how she would have got that role as me, someone that I'm a Protestant, but I don't know a lot about church history. I'm like, well, that's odd. Like, you have 2 bishops in the family, and somehow she became the spiritual mentor. So how did that come to be?
There's this really famous icon or image
Mm,
of the Cappadocians that the Eastern Orthodox tradition uses whenever they talk about the Cappadocians, and it's an image of Macrina, and then she's holding a picture of her brothers. I was like, well, it's pretty obvious who they think is the brains behind the outfit here. So how that happened is being the older sister. And her mother, who's still living, Amelia, they were very close. They were a pretty close
mm,
knit family, and a large family. And her mother was really sort of overtaken by grief. And Basil was not really around. He was kind of already like I remember when this happened. I think he was at school at this point. You're going to
mm.
catch me on the timeline. I don't know where he was, but he was not around much.
Okay.
So Macarena was. This was prior to them having a lot of that of those positions and that kind of thing. But
Mm,
even so, your question's a good one. Like, how did she end up that way? Because Gregory actually says that she becomes their father and their mother and their mentor. Basically, she became everything
mm,
to the family. And where that comes from is sort of seeing someone's strength of character and strength of virtue and recognizing it for what it is, regardless of gender, regardless of birth order. So what he's saying there is that Macrina has a strength of virtue and character that allowed her not to be overtaken by grief, but to become kind of a refuge for the rest of the family
mm.
that they all leaned on.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, yeah. This is just a quote. You mentioned that, or Gregory of Nyssa mentions that father, mother, teacher, advisor, guardian, among other things, is what she was. Educating, comforting, developing a devoted community.
Mhm.
One interesting thing was it was a woman who prompted our narrative, if that is, we may call her a woman, for I do not know if it is appropriate to apply a name drawn from nature to one who has risen above nature. So that was Gregory of Nyssa talking about Macrina. What do you mean by that?
Well, I didn't write that. Gregory wrote that.
Right.
So, what did he say? This was this is one of the first lines of the life of Macrina. So it seems a little bit weird when you're talking about somebody that you love, have a very close relationship with, that you want to emulate, and you say, "Yeah, like I don't know if I can call her a woman." Like it seems seems a little bit derogatory. So
Huh.
what's going on here? So we actually see this in a variety of early Christian texts,
Okay.
where when both in Latin and Greek, you have they really struggled to talk about virtue when it was not being associated with men. So specifically in Latin, like the word virtue, the prefix there is actually the word in Latin for man. So when you are calling someone virtuous, you're literally saying that they are manly.
Oh wow.
And they had some of the same struggles in Greek. And so there was the problem was largely Gregory was saying, like, basically, language cannot encapsulate what I need to say about my sister. I can't call because, like, calling someone a woman in that context
Hmm.
was actually, and he didn't think that women were like sub creatures. He wasn't saying anything like that. He was
Okay.
basically talking about the context that there was no way for him to give that there was no language that was available to him that would allow him to say that as a woman that she was fully virtuous, that she was strong, that she was brave,
Yeah.
that she was intelligent even.
Hmm.
There was just a lot of limitations. So what he's trying to say is actually basically she breaks the mold.
Hmm.
Like he was trying to demonstrate both the limits of what he had to work with, but also also how amazing she is. And this is interesting in the early Christian tradition, and we see this in Scripture too, where how often the Christian values and virtues and practices they struggled to find language to describe
Hmm.
what it was. We see this a lot in Paul. We see this even in what they called themselves. They called themselves an ecclesia, right? Which is just a word for gathering, but it not. We translate it as church now, but that's not what it meant. Like,
Hmm.
so there was a lot of adaptation of words and ideas in order to describe what this gospel meant to people, what the change was about. Because all of a sudden, women and enslaved people were a part of a church and also had value, but there were no words for that. Because another example of this would be the word it's slave. So the word slave in Latin is res, res. It just means thing, like property.
Hmm.
So there was you couldn't call a slave a human. But then all of a sudden you have scripture and people being made in the image of God that breaks
Hmm.
those categories. And so there was a lot of struggling to describe
Huh.
people. And so that's what you see. You see a work in progress in what Gregory's trying to do. He's
Yeah.
refusing to let language control the narrative of his sister.
Hmm. That's really fascinating. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So uh, another interesting thing that I noted was like in 21st century group an evangelical home, like you have this idea of like, the father is the head of the household, and there's of course a debate about how we're even supposed to take a view on that and all that kind of stuff.
Small,
But
very small debate.
yeah, small
Very
debate.
small debate.
But I never thought to myself like, what was it like back then? Like in this situation, I'm expecting, say, a father dies, one of the men in the household, or maybe the mother. Like it's possible, you have like a little bit of Greek culture where there are prominent women when the husband dies. But yeah, so do we know much about if there was an idea of like a spiritual head of the household in this time period, or was this normal for? I mean, I would assume this is not normal for a woman to just be considered the, the spiritual leader.
It was a little in some ways, I would say. I mean, part of this is, I will say with slight caveat
Mm,
that we don't have all the evidence that I would like
right.
on this. I mean, most of the women we know about are women from elite households who have a lot of power.
Hmm.
And Macrina would be one of those. She's not one of the most elite households that we know of, but we don't generally have we have very few narratives from people on the underside of power or um, uh, who, just that kind of thing. So we're dealing with people that have a lot of power in some ways, even if it's restricted according to gender or according to social class or whatnot.
Hmm.
So I would say that there is no like category of spiritual head of household. It's not a thing. I mean, because in Roman culture, Greco-Roman culture, you have the paterfamilias.
Right.
So that's the father. The father is the head of the household, head completely. Like there was no, who decides that we're going to raise this child and and not this one. I mean, a lot of power, economically, and that would include the devotional power of the family, like which Roman gods we are
Hmm.
devoted to in the household and such. And so some of that is going to translate over, but as you notice, like there's a ton of language in scripture about how families are differently structured in the Christian tradition.
Hmm.
And so this was a really sort of wild time of and also laws were changing. There were several emperors that changed like laws where widows were able to inherit a significant amount of money and be able
Hmm.
to. So there was a lot of things actually legally changing alongside Christians sort of working out what does it mean to be a family in the house of God, which was very different than how some Roman families were structured, but yet what of the Roman family do they keep and what don't they? And so with the story around Macrina, you see a really interesting kind of experiment of what a family could look like and would look like.
Hmm.
There's other examples. I think of the Diary of Perpetua and Felicitas, for instance, where
Hmm.
you have Perpetua looking her paterfamilias father in the face and saying, "Yeah, I'm a Christian. Sorry." Like, and and he like throws himself on the ground and says like, you're making my hair gray, like you're basically bringing shame upon on the family.
Hmm.
And like he's the only one that even tried to reach out to her. Like the rest of her family wouldn't even talk to her. He would. But she's like, yeah, no, that's not who I am. And her saying that like breaks the Roman mind. Like
Yeah.
there's no saying I'm not part of this family anymore. That's just not how it worked. But in the Christian tradition, it was. All of a sudden, the family is kind of turned on its head. So you're seeing a lot of in process, but kind of the debates that we have now are really, I would really hesitate to make any comparison because they're that different.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Okay. Uh, so, uh, so you mentioned that at least one of the bishops was gone when I guess she would have had to step up.
Mm-hmm.
But were they both gone? Is that your theory? Like that's why one of the bishops didn't step up because they were both, um, like they were just busy. So,
I mean, they weren't the only ones in the household. There was also other, like there was Peter, there was Naucratius, there were other sons there too.
oh, okay.
So yeah, Naucratius, who he actually dies, is swept away in a flood. He was somebody, he went out and like lived an ascetic life. He had like his own little cabin and like
Oh, wow.
fished for his food and did all this stuff. But he was very well loved in the family and died probably somewhere in his mid to late 20s as a guess. There's also Peter, who does Peter of Sebasti, who was a bishop as well. So there are three bishops in that family.
Oh, okay.
But they didn't. There wasn't really that's kind of the point here is there wasn't really an understanding that being like at least for Gregory that being a bishop had anything to do with or any conflict with who was being sort of in spiritual teaching or doing anything in the household.
Mm,
Gregory does not communicate that there was any kind of issue with that. In
Mm.
fact, what he does in his document on the soul and the resurrection is he places Macrina in the role not only of he puts her, it's modeled after Plato's Phaedo on the soul,
Mm.
where on Socrates' deathbed everybody's sitting around and listening to Socrates talk, including Plato. So in this piece, Gregory puts Macrina in the position of Socrates and puts himself as the pupil who's trying to learn from her. And I actually argue elsewhere, not in that book, but elsewhere, that he's not only mimicking or talking about Socrates there, but he's actually putting himself in the position of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, like he does in the household of Lazarus. And that he doesn't seem to have any issue with that whatsoever. There's no communication of that in his letters. There's no sort of concern that as a woman this is going to be problematic for himself as a man. At least that's not communicated in these pieces. Now, we do have material from other early Christians who, have very strong opinions about, Tertullian's a fun one. He writes this amazing letter about his wife and how awesome she is, and then turns around and talks about women being the devil's gateway. So, so we do have, the conversations were different.
Yeah.
They were about different things. But this kind of like obsession with kind of apportioning out roles was not what they did. Yeah.
I can't help. I was listening to a video. I can't remember what scholar it was, but they mentioned how in the Roman world that, as a man or whatever, it's like you're going to go, use rhetoric and talk to people out in the open and all that kind of stuff. That's the man's job. And then the woman can have great virtues, but supposed to be in the home. So, yeah. I mean, is it possible that maybe that's the idea? That's why it was so easily, because, that's where she would have, if she's the spiritual guide of the family, then she'd be at the home, right? Is that it?
I mean, that might have been a little bit helpful. In the book, I call her an ascetic entrepreneur. She does something quite radical, though, because she it seems like she's doing something that is confined to their home, but she actually makes a huge economic decision by emancipating their slaves. And that would not have been something that would have reverberated throughout their entire community, and not just in their household.
Yeah.
And those lines, they do change. I mentioned kind of some of the legal changes. The Romans had a lot of opinions about, women are the ones who would show the virtues of endurance and modesty and all this sort of stuff. And some of that kind of overarching abstract stuff held. But then you have, I talk about later in the book, Eudokia, right? Who's an empress who has a rhetorician for a father, and she is trained by the best rhetoricians in the entire empire. And they come and listen to her, and she goes and listens to them, and she writes, and she does, and the emperor sends her around and she does speeches because everybody wants to hear her talk. And so she's eminently trained. So, I mean, and I will say again, elite women had more flexibility and access than others would have. And it also depended on your school of philosophy. So it was very well known that in the Platonic school, women were there was a perspective there that there wasn't like a gendered soul. So like women could learn. They might have obstacles that are different than men, but there was no sort of inherent issue where they couldn't access them. Now, other philosophical traditions would say, like Aristotle, women are basically mutated men. So not, that'd be the peripatetic school. So there was a cultural issue there.
Yeah.
But Christianity, because of what they're reading in the scripture, they keep running up against these cultural things. So they're both like swallowing some of it, but also challenging it and and women were like, oh, hey, like, just to give you an example of how radical this was really for a Greco-Roman woman, you had two options. You were either married or not yet married. Like those were the two options, right? And many periods in history have been like that for women. But the Christianity comes around, and all of a sudden there's like, well, I could be married, not yet married, or I could be widowed. And that was a ordained position in the church. Or I could be a virgin, which was, again, like an ordained position in the church, where that's not just a lifestyle devotional choice. That is an economic choice, where some very rich women and women across the spectrum are saying, yeah, I think I'm not going to deliver you an heir and completely throw the Roman economy all over the place. And we actually have examples of that, where in one of the chapters of the book, I talk about Melania the Younger, who gets married to her husband Pinion. And she, on their wedding night, she's like, hey, so I really just want to live in a celibate marriage. Can you imagine? And he goes, well, basically for economic reasons, and because we're both like super high up in the Senate, with our status and all this sort of thing, we need to have 2 kids. And she was like, fine. And so they had 2 children. Both of them died early in life. And he said, okay, now we're gonna have a spiritual marriage for the rest of our lives. So they actually lived as sort of in the monastic tradition after that. The other thing they did was they emancipated their slaves. And Melania the Younger was like Jeff Bezos rich. So when she did that, it was different than Macrina, who was not that kind of wealthy. When she did that, the empress literally went to her and said, please don't do that. You are going to tank our economy.
Wow.
And Melania said, oh, well, and did it anyway. So you just have examples of that, of all these changes. And so you see kind of the tensions constantly, the arguments that they're having, where they're trying to work all of this out. But so the Christians were the ones coming face to face with this over and over again, having this constant dialogue with Scripture, with the people who are, experiencing calls from the Spirit. What do we do with them? And also with the Roman culture around them.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so can you talk about some other women in the early church where something similar is happening, where they're being called by male terms? And is it exactly the same as what's going on with Macrina, or is it a little different?
There's some that are very similar. There's a lot of there's actually a couple books on this where talking about manly women, because they didn't. Again, there was no word to call to basically say that a woman has virtue or has courage. All of these words were centered around having maleness in some way, or living into the male ideal. And so there were women who, for Macrina wasn't the only one, but there were a variety of different ways that they would describe. I mentioned Perpetua and Felicitas in Perpetua's diary. So she lived in Carthage. And they were martyred in about 205. So this is good 150 years or more than before Macrina. And Perpetua, who is a woman of noble birth, and her and one of the slaves in their household, Felicitas, are both imprisoned, and they're imprisoned with a whole group of Christians. And Perpetua she has these dreams, and the Diary of Perpetua is one of the few documents that we have from early Christianity that we're pretty sure was actually written by her, at least partially. There's also a narrator or an editor that goes back and kind of redacts things, that inserts themselves, but as far as we can tell, we have Perpetua's writing, her diary, and she shares 3 visions, and one of those visions that she has is of her going into an arena. And she is in the dream, she's a gladiator. And she's fighting an Egyptian, other gladiator. There's a whole lot of biblical imagery going on there about Exodus and all sorts of stuff, and Pharaoh and blah, blah. But she's in the arena and she's a male gladiator. And it talks about how, that she became male. And the language there is really interesting. Like if you actually look at the Latin, it's a very funny statement, and it doesn't actually seem to make sense. It uses the feminine form in order to say that she became man, meaning she didn't actually like she didn't actually have to become a man in order to be in order to access what she needed to do here, in order to, but it was her trying to explain that she became brave and virtuous, like the sort of the fullness of herself. Like that was so she actually uses, like, messes with grammar in order to explain what she's trying to say. And to describe what she's seeing.
Yeah.
So she doesn't need to become a man technically in order to win, but that's the form that she sees in her brain, and that's what she has to use grammatically in order to explain the extremity of the strength that she displayed. So we have a lot of examples of that. We also have examples of women doing things like cutting their hair, and doing a lot of other sort of cultural things that would not be what a woman would be expected to do, in order to sort of live into what they understood God asking them to do. Thecla is a good example of that too. They lived very early on.
Yeah. Yeah. Paulinus of Nola says of Marcella, what a woman she is, if one can call so virile a Christian a woman. Yes. Really interesting.
You hear that language, virile, right? Like
Okay.
vir, V-I-R at the beginning, the root of that is Latin for male. So basically she's saying manly. Right? Like, so that's what I mean. There's no escaping.
Oh, wow.
Like, how do I call her? I can't call her a woman because that would diminish what I'm trying to say. I mean, that just shows like how baked into sort of humanity it is that women are not viewed as fully human. So what do you do as Christians at the time when you're like, actually, the Holy Spirit, when you're dealing with Pentecost, when you have Pentecost and you have Jesus and Paul connecting with women in these ways that were so countercultural, and that your understanding of the eschaton was that we were all going to be brothers and sisters, and that, you know, they were just trying to figure all of that out.
Right. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about Pulcheria. So you talked about how she did some interesting things around the Eucharist. Can you just give us a summary of what she did, what she's known for, and all that?
Sure. So Pulcheria is an empress who lived in the 5th century. And she is responsible for, so if you know much about sort of the history of Christian doctrine, in early Christianity, there were 4 major councils that decided major theological topics. So the one that many are familiar with is the Council of Nicaea, right? That's 325. That's the one where we said Arianism, subordinating Jesus as being a creature in the Trinity, no can do, we're not going to do that. And so that's when they wrote the Nicene Creed, the first draft of it. The second draft of that is going to be at the Council of Constantinople in 381. That's the one that Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea were involved in. So the Nicene Creed that we say in churches now is the one from 381, where they expanded the language on the Holy Spirit and all that kind of stuff. So those are known as the 2 like Trinitarian councils. And then Trinitarian councils brought up a very interesting question. Well, how in the world is it that Jesus is fully God and fully human at the same time? And then they started working on this question. And the 2 councils that were dedicated to that were the Council of Ephesus in 431 and the Council of Chalcedon in 451. So those are very close together, 20 years apart. And Empress Pulcheria was at the center of both of those. She was a big deal. She was a theologian in her own right. So she was the daughter of Theodosius I. Theodosius I was the one who presided over the Council of Constantinople in 381. He's the one that in 380 said Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine did not do that. Theodosius did in 380 and said, you know, now all Roman religions are illegal, etc., etc. So Theodosius I was He also had the Theodosian codes, which was a huge legal overhaul of the Roman Empire that are still, a lot of those are actually, I mean, they're still really studied today as really significant in the history of sort of law and governmental structure. So he was a powerhouse, and Pulcheria was his oldest child. So Pulcheria, and there was a couple sisters in there, and then there was Theodosius II. So Theodosius I dies when Pulcheria is 13 years old, and when Theodosius II is 7. So all of a sudden, you have an emperor who is 7. And so there's a whole a bunch of jockeying of position around who's going to be in control of this giant empire. And Pulcheria makes a decision. She says, I am a consecrated virgin of Jesus Christ, which was a move. I mean, I mean, whew. I mean, basically she said, you can't marry me off. Good luck trying. You'll have to take it up with God. So there was no sending her off anywhere. And then she turns the palace into a monastery in order to control who goes in and goes out. And then she's the one who takes Theodosius under her wing. And basically, I call it in the book Emperor Charm School for one. And so she protects him and their family. And her sisters also became consecrated virgins so that they would also not be married off before Pulcheria was cool with it. And then he later becomes emperor. But he wasn't like his father. He wanted to write poetry and like hang out. He was a little bit scatterbrained. There's this great story. So she gets him married to Eudokia. I mentioned her earlier. So she's the wife of Theodosius II. She's the rhetorician. So Pulcheria is the one that makes all of that happen. And then she notices that Theodosius isn't paying a whole lot of attention to his imperial duties. And so she actually tests him by creating a memo that sells his wife into slavery and puts it on his desks, and he signs the thing because he didn't read it. And then she makes a big point out of it. So what I'm trying to say is that she has an astounding amount of power.
Yeah.
But what was central to her was not just, I mean, she did a lot of running the empire. And then after her brother dies, she takes over basically assumes power of the empire as much as she could. If technically an empress couldn't do anything with the military, she did. Technically an empress couldn't do X, Y, and Z. She did all of the things. But one of the things that happens to get to that Council of Ephesus, where they're trying to figure out how Jesus is fully divine and fully human, is that that's the council where they're dealing with Nestorius. People might have heard of Nestorianism, who is known for separating the natures of Jesus to the point where he kind of is like two people living in one body, a divine being and a human being, kind of living two separate lives. And Pulcheria, when her brother had brought in Nestorius because he was this really well-known bishop in Antioch, and Theodosius II was kind of a weak emperor, so he was looking for ways to show his strength. And he brings in Nestorius. The problem is that Nestorius was coming into basically the early Christian version of New York meets Las Vegas. So or Washington, D.C. I'll put Washington, D.C. in there too, like with all the political intrigue, the entertainment value, the kind of splash and dash. Like Constantinople was a place that ran on intrigue and pomp and circumstance. And Nestorius just wanted to study his biblical Greek and do his thing. And he had no time for parties or schmoozing and Pulcheria. And so she had gotten used to, and not just her, but the entire imperial family got used to taking the Eucharist with the priests. Because as a consecrated virgin and as empress, she held a position that basically was higher than pretty much anyone else except the priests. And so she would take the Eucharist behind what's called the rood screen. So kind of up on the, in kind of separate from the rest of the community. And that was a huge honor, and it was generally associated for people who were set apart, like priests, which would also be her too. And she understood herself as a virgin and as someone in that way who is modeling her life, living as Christ, living a life that was Christologically shaped. So when Nestorius is celebrating the Eucharist and Easter, and she comes in and she's getting ready to go up there and have Eucharist or take Eucharist with the priests, and Nestorius says, "You turn your little empress self right around and leave." Yeah. So let's just say that she was the wrong person to make upset. So she starts writing her friend Cyril in Alexandria, who was a major theologian, and they get into this whole, we don't have her letters, but we do have the letters in response to her, where Cyril is calling on her to use her power, where Cyril is relying on her to use not only her political power, but also her theological prowess. And fast forward, a lot of drama. She's the one who situates the Council of Ephesus in Ephesus. Theodosius wanted it in Constantinople, ends up moving it to Ephesus, which was a powerhouse space for her perspective and not for Nestorius. And he got in a bit of trouble there, including being called a heretic. And then 20 years later, she also presides over the Council of Chalcedon, where they have really sort of nailed down Christological thought. So that's who she is. And she was both a political power and also a spiritual power. But she doesn't fit in our typical structure because she wasn't a bishop. She was a consecrated virgin, but by virtue of the fact of also being an empress, she had more power than any other consecrated virgin. So she pretty much acted and never asked forgiveness for later. Like, we have a really hard time processing this because we don't have empresses. We don't know what that's like. We think queen, but a lot more power. I mean, I guess Queen Elizabeth was in some ways, because of all the colonies, was kind of like over an empire, but we never called her an empress. So we really struggle to kind of actually process how much power she had. But her self-understanding was that all of this was about Christ. Now, we might agree or disagree with how she went about it, but that was her understanding.
Yeah.
Which is amazing and very interesting. There were several empresses like that. Later, Theodora was very similar. So there was a pattern. Helena, Constantine's mother, she's the one who the legend of finding the true cross in Jerusalem is associated with. So we have a whole line of empresses who are outside of the church theological and authoritative structure, but who hold an astounding amount of power, both theologically as well as politically.
So just for clarity, so you, when do you need to go?
I have about 10 minutes.
Okay. All right. We're good. So, all right. So this is just a really fascinating story to me. Okay. One, it was Nestorius. So he goes from being a well-known authority, he goes to the church, and he's like, "Oh, what is this woman doing today?" So clearly he had some authority. He felt like he had the power to say, "Get out of here," right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he gets labeled a heretic shortly after. So that's crazy to me. Okay.
Well, it wasn't all of a sudden. And I will say Nestorius, it wasn't just Pulcheria. He alienated basically everyone, including his own people from Antioch, who were originally on his side, who agreed with him theologically, but he was not capable of compromise, and really struggled to communicate in ways. He was very inflexible. He was very smart and was very capable, but he just really struggled in some ways that he really actually needed some interpersonal skills that he did not have. And he made a lot of people mad. I mean, Cyril was actually the one, to be fair, it wasn't Pulcheria. It was Cyril who laid the law down on him, the major bishop from Alexandria, who called him and everyone in Antioch a heretic, basically.
Wow.
Which, of course, didn't go down very well.
Yeah, that's wild. Okay, so one thing was Pulcheria had these robes on the altar during communion. So I mean, I don't know if I go to a church today and I get my jacket and I put my jacket next to the stage, they'll probably move it. It won't be as big of a deal, probably. But the altar is it's a big deal, and communion's a huge deal, apparently.
Mhm.
So why would she feel the need to do this? What was the purpose of this? Why
Yeah.
didn't they like burn it?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is just different traditions.
Yeah.
So I mean, think about how in some traditions, they're like vestments, right, where priests wear particular robes and
Yeah.
particular stoles for particular occasions.
Hmm.
You know how during Advent or specifically during Lent, right, where we might drape the cross in purple or in black.
Hmm.
And that would be around the altar, like draping the altar in purple or black.
Hmm.
So liturgically, it's like vestments for furniture. So think
Right.
of it that way. Like what she did was basically like she, from her perspective, what she's doing is she is submitting her presence and her authority
Hmm.
to the Eucharist, to Christ.
Huh.
And so what she's doing, I mean, it looks like from like the perspective you read it at, which makes total sense. It looks like she's like kind of putting herself over
Yeah.
the Eucharist, when actually from her perspective, and I think a good read of it is actually that she
Uh,
self understood herself as actually submitting her, like with her robe. I mean, it's like her vestment as an empress is being submitted to the
mm,
sacrifice of Christ.
yeah, that's fascinating.
So it's
Yeah, she's.
linking. It's a submission and it's a
Hmm.
linking to Christ
Yeah.
as a even. I mean, it was creative. I will
Right.
say that it was creative, but it wasn't. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was like sort of out of bounds, but it is definitely a particular liturgical
Hmm.
exercise that
Interesting.
probably a lot of modern people would find weird, but that's what was
Right.
going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and she's called Bride of Christ.
Mhm,
Uh, I think in the book you said she had a special bond with Christ.
mhm.
But um, so yeah.
And I'll note the Bride of Christ reference. Most of virgins would have
Mm,
understood themselves that way, so
oh, okay.
that wasn't super weird. But for
Okay.
her, it had an added element of
Yeah.
political, like you can't marry me off.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what you kind of mentioned it. She's a priest. Did she consider herself a priest or
No,
okay? Um, but she did receive the Eucharist in an area where only priests were supposed to receive it, right?
with the priest, but I mean the imperial household would do that. It wasn't just her.
Okay. So this
Yeah.
was this something that was brand new or like just for that family, or did it happen often in that time period?
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I mean, it is remarked upon that this was kind of exceptional, but I don't know if the practice actually started with her.
Hmm.
I get the impulse that, I mean, it was definitely a matter of discussion. So I don't know if Pulcheria did something
Yeah.
or her family did something specific that really put her on the map to do that
Mm,
differently. But I can't confidently say that
yeah.
they were the first.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say that wasn't. I mean, obviously that doesn't happen prior to Constantine
Mm,
because emperors weren't Christians. But I mean, what you see here is a larger story of what does it look like that the Roman Empire is Christianized. When you
right.
have, I mean, and she's really pretty early in that story. Like it's her father who establishes Christianity as the official religion of the empire. So
Mm,
it's really only been a short period of time where the church and the imperial family are actually trying to figure one another out. So it is new, um, and they're trying to figure out what that relationship looks
mm,
like. And they're not. Pulcheria doesn't try to claim ordination in like a priestly way.
mm,
Although interestingly, I mean Constantine, right? He oversees the Council of Nicaea, and empresses and emperors, well, specifically emperors, convened councils.
mm,
So like bishops, like Cyril couldn't call a council. Theodosius had to.
mm,
So, I mean, that relationship was fraught. I mean, just think about our relationships that we have between Christianity and the state, right? Like, I mean, that's a long conversation.
Yeah.
That really started around this time period.
Yeah.
Trying to figure that out.
Yeah, that's wild. Okay. And okay, so the reason I asked about the priest thing is in the book you said Pulcheria's entrance into the sanctuary of the great church on Easter to take communion with the priest and the emperor makes sense on the level of her enacting the priestly character of an Augustus, but also on the level of her as a virgin functioning in the priestly role as Christ did, as both priest and sacrifice. So was she like doing the role of a priest but not formally a priest? Or
Yeah,
what did you mean by that?
Yeah, it's sort of a larger, thinking about like the offices of Christ, like Christ is prophet, Christ is priest, Christ is king. So I'm not talking about it in the sense of there's a larger theological frame that Pulcheria is understanding here. So, so emperors and the imperial household, not just emperors, were the ones who you could actually offer sacrifices to the emperor. To the emperor, well, not to the emperor, to the emperor's genius, like what the emperor represents, like burn incense and stuff. So there were priests, there was sort of priestly and by like pagan priestly structures before Roman armies went out to battle. Right, the duty of an emperor there would be to basically go before the gods on their behalf to intercede. So I mean it in that role, like there's this really interesting relationship between the kind of leftover pomp and circumstance of the imperial role of Caesar, of emperor, of empress, and then also, but tied together with kind of living into Christ's life. And there's shared language there of priestliness. So you see here with Pulcheria and her family, they're kind of colliding and intersecting and interweaving. So it's not just about ordination or a particular position in the church. It's like a theological space that is being communicated alongside, in tandem with, in partnership with, and perhaps in conflict with. That's all happening.
Right. Yeah, I think the most fascinating thing about that is that you had one person, Nestorius, who's like, yeah, no, that's not happening. And then you had other people who clearly were okay with it in some regards. Really weird. Okay. All right. Well, otherwise, thank you so much for coming on. Really a pleasure. We'll definitely have to do this again. Thank you so much. Everybody check out her book, and it'll be in the description. Any last words?
Oh, I just had so much fun talking about women in Christianity. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. Well, I'll see you later. Have a good rest of your day.
Alrighty. Bye.